Well, hello, hello, hello. Welcome everyone to our third Womanist Wednesday of the month of June. We're in June.
2022.
20 and 22.
I think this is our fourth. Is it our fourth year doing this?
I think it is. Is our fourth or fifth year?
No, it has to be fourth.
It has to be fourth year. Okay, that's right. That's right.
We need to figure that out.
We do. But we are delighted that our friends and on Facebook and YouTube are joining us. We see the DigiDeacon Natasha Robinson is here. We see Shayla Belcher is here. And I'm sure there are going to be more people joining us.
Yeah, we see more people joining. And if you're watching, let us know you're watching. I know Angela has joined us. And if you're on YouTube, let us know. We're going to give a couple minutes for the people to get in the room because we don't want them to miss out on what Dr. Dunbar Hill has to say. Hey, Reverend Winter, good to see you.
Yes, and speaking of Dunbar Hill, we want to welcome our Womanist Wednesday scholar, biblical scholar, Hebrew Bible scholar, Dr. Ericka Shawndrika Dunbar Hill.
All right.
Thank you so much for joining us. We are delighted and cannot wait to get started with our conversation. How are you feeling tonight?
I'm feeling great. Thank you. Thank you both for the invitation to engage in this dialogue. I'm excited.
It's our pleasure. And at the appropriate time, we will reveal. We both got one of your books. I've got one, and she's got the, Reverend Camila has got the other one.
And we want the people to get one, too.
We absolutely do. We absolutely do. You are doing and have done some groundbreaking work. And it's something that every student of the Bible, particularly people who preach it and teach it, need to have access to these books for their study and their scholarship. So let's go ahead and get started. All right.
Yes.
So my first question is, who are you, Dr. Dunbar? Not as in what you do, right? Because we always talk about what we do, but who are you?
Thank you. And it's fine to call me Ericka. That's my
Okay.
preference. So I am a being, right, that's made of glorious matter. I am discerning who God is calling me to be and what God is calling me to do daily, so that when I'm resting beneath the sod, those who gather to process my transition can be comforted in the fact that I endeavored to leave no work undone, right? I am becoming, and in becoming, I am intentional about becoming more loving, about becoming more respectful, and becoming more reverent, not just of other living beings, but of God, to the ancestors and to the earth, everyone and everything that's in this ecosystem that sustains life. I am a very empathetic being, someone that's committed to practices of collaboration and of weaving together or interconnecting people and perspectives across place and space and time in purposeful and productive ways. I am not just concerned about my own well being, but of the wellness and the wholeness of everyone. And just because it's, I think, clear in my work, I'm a person that hates violence and oppression. And so I
Uh-huh.
find myself constantly bucking up against systems whose mechanisms are to violently oppress and abuse people. So
Wow.
that's that's me.
See what happens when we ask people, who are you, not what you do,
Right.
but what is it that makes you you, right? Makes you have the ways of thinking, being, and doing that you have. So thank you for sharing that. Now, you've got a PhD in Hebrew Bible. Now,
I
what made
do.
you pursue that? Reverend Camila is doing the same thing. One day we're gonna have you on Womanist Wednesday too. But okay.
I need to get to
Right.
what she gets. I'm
Put you on this side of
I'm
the
on this
table.
side. I'm gonna stay on this side. You stay on this side.
But what
No,
made
we
you
need to hear
pursue
you.
that PhD
Yeah.
in Hebrew Bible?
So in short, and I'll expound, but curiosity is
Mm.
what kind of caused me to pursue a PhD in Old Testament. I was curious about many of the events in the Bible, curious about many persons' interpretations of text, and that's both individuals and communities. Curious about how ancient contexts shape text, curious about
Wow.
how open people are to diverse interpretations of text,
Mm-hmm.
curious about how people would engage the questions that I have of text, curious about what other sacred sources inform believers and how those non-biblical sacred sources intersect with biblical texts. Um, Curious about how the text not only impact us spiritually, but how material bodies and psyches are impacted by sacred texts. And curious about whether the God I was at that time and am in relationship aligns with the God depictions of God in the Bible.
Mm.
So I came to this work trying to make sense out of life and trying to make sense out of how people relate to others, which I believe is informed by sacred texts and how we interpret and apply those texts.
That's good.
Wow.
Whew, okay, so we're gonna talk about some of the work you have been doing with that curiosity, because you have a book. Let's talk about her book, Trafficking Hadassah: Collective Trauma, Cultural Memory, and Identity in the Book of Esther and in the African Diaspora.
Let's hold it up.
Yeah, I have to read it first, get the whole. But you come at a whole bunch of stuff with your curiosity. You got some really really good questions. But one of the things you really talk about is you talk about sexual trafficking that occurs in Esther, right? And your chapter, the one night with the king. That's the first chapter of the book. Now it shatters people's illusions and ideas of Esther. Like, you start out kind of breaking that down. But why did you start out in the way that you started out in that chapter? And why did you choose to go with trafficking? Because you got some curiosity. I know you had all kind of questions, but what made you lean into those?
Can I say
Yeah.
one thing before you? So, trafficking Hadassah. So you used the name Hadassah. You didn't use the word Esther. And I say that because people watching may not.
Right.
Who's Hadassah? What's that?
Right.
So, frame that, and then answer that question.
Right. So let me first say that my curiosity was really fed at the Interdenominational Theological Center, like in the classrooms of Randall Bailey, Margaret Amer, so many great people, Beverly Wallace. In fact, it was a, I guess, senior project for at ITC. I had no idea I was going to pursue a PhD, and I did not go enter into the PhD program knowing that this would be my dissertation, but it just so happened that I came back to this work. So I just wanted to shout out ITC because I think that it was a curiosity lab that really heightened my imaginative capacity. Um, and so I chose Trafficking Hadassah, which really I have to shout out Randall Bailey again because he helped me in the that title, because one of the features of trafficking, well, several of the features are silence, invisibility, minimizing one's identity, right? And so many people don't know that Hadassah is Esther, that Hadassah is her Hebrew name, and Esther is her Persian name. And so this is a part of that movement of say her name, right? We're
Right.
not
Right.
masking who she is, or who she was forced to become, but we're saying her name, and we're sharing her story, as
Yeah.
well as the stories of all of the other nameless girls in the book of Esther that often gets glossed over, right? And so that's how we ended up with trafficking Hadassah. And to answer your first question, Camilla, there are several points that I'd like to make. The first is that there were too many interpretations of the book, particularly chapter 2, that was framing what was happening as beauty pageantry, right?
Mm.
So
Wow.
they're describing the events of chapter 2 as a beauty pageant, where, in contemporary settings, most persons that enter pageants are doing so on their own will.
Right.
Like, right? They're choosing to enter that space. And so they're describing this, what I understand is sexual abuse, as a fun game where contestants are being chosen because of their beauty. And um, I'm really resisting this notion of sexual trauma being cast as something that's trivial and laughable. Because
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
I'm pulling back. Ain't nothing funny about sex trafficking, sex
Right.
abuse, right? Um, Also, many interpreters did not give much attention to the ethnicities of the girls that are captured and exploited. So there are references to geographical locales, that are also references to national and ethnic identities, if we, kind of put these clues together. And so it just so happens that Africa and India, those references that are made in chapter 1, are both central to the Ma'afa, or the transatlantic slave trade, right? And these are also places where contemporary Black and brown girls are abused at disproportionate rates. And so I
Mm.
needed to make this connection, across contexts where Black and brown girls are being targeted for sexual abuse. Um, in addition to minimizing, or ignoring the ethnicities of the girls, I didn't see where intersectionality was being foregrounded in
Mm-hmm.
these interpretations either. So these girls are not chosen solely on the basis of gender, right? But they're abused and trafficked at the intersections of their ethnicity, of their gender, of their class, of their beauty, of their colonial status. They're colonized, right? Of their age. We talk about ability, but we don't really think about sexual ability. They're chosen because of their sexual ability, perceived sexual ability, because of their virgin status, right? Virginal status, among, excuse me, among other factors. So we need to foreground intersectionality in this conversation of sex trafficking. And another point that I am making is that sexual trafficking is initiated in chapter 1, right, with the sexual exploitation of Vashti. So the king endeavors to subject her to the sexualized gaze of his inebriated male guests, which is the initiation of sexual exploitation. And it's after she resists that exploitation and abuse that she's punished, but her punishment is not just for her. Those virgin girls are punished as well. So I'm
Mm.
claiming that sexual exploitation is initiated in chapter 1 with Vashti, and then it's intensified in chapter 2 with the trafficking of those girls. And so we have this tendency to pit, Vashti and Esther against one
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
another,
Right.
right? And read their stories as if they're not connected, but they are connected. And so I'm resisting that type of pitting women against each other, and um, focusing on individuals as opposed to the collective.
Mm.
Um, and I'm also trying to illuminate that in the book of Esther, sexual trafficking is premeditated, it is systemic, and it is systematic. That there are multiple parties that are involved in setting up this trafficking economy. You have the king, you have his eunuchs, you have the commissioners, you have those who are participating in beautifying the girls, and all of them are culpable of this abuse. And so I want us to be attentive to the sex trafficking economies and the mechanisms, right, of the colonizers, these systems that are abusing and exploiting girls. But I also want us to pay attention to the silence and the silencing of characters, right? Because we tend to think that silence, inaudible, like because people are inaudible, that there's nothing to be said, there's nothing being said. But I think silence is very loud, and it really illuminates some of the interior feelings and some of the issues related to sex trafficking. But it's also a tool of traffickers. They
That's right.
silence, invisibility, namelessness, all of those are tools of traffickers. Even beauty,
That's
right? So
right.
I'm saying this is not a beauty contest, but traffickers they use beauty and beautification in order to prepare girls and women for the trafficking experience, the sexual exploitation experience. So what I'm saying is recognize that these are tools used by trafficking persons that are in trafficking systems. And I want us to be attentive to collective trauma, not just focus on individual experiences, but look at collective trauma. And finally, look at how collective memory functions for groups whose identity is impacted by these deep intergenerational traumas. I think you also asked me, Camilla, like why or how I chose to address trafficking, right? And it's because I wanted to just name a thing for what I knew it was, right? And really highlight how horrific trafficking is, especially child sex trafficking. Because sex trafficking, if you look at the definitions, it includes movements across borders for the purpose of sex, right? And so many people hadn't been attentive to this movement in the text. So you have movement across national and geographical borders, and then you have movement from these girls' homes to the
Yeah.
king's palace, and then once inside the palace, you have movement from whatever space that the beautification is happening to the harem of the wives, to the bedroom of the king, to the harem of the concubines. There's constant movement
Right. Right.
place to place, right? And that's that movement across borders for the purpose of sex, because they're brought there to have sex with the king. But not only are they taken across these spatial borders, but when in the king's harem, in the king's bedroom, like he's actually transgressing their bodily and their sexual boundaries. So I think forced migration is, and boundary crossing is another theme that's really glossed over in the narrative.
Yeah. Oh yeah, you unpacked a lot right there. But I'm glad that you first of all named it for what you saw it is in the text, because sometimes that's not what's happening. But I'm thinking, like, reason why we do Womanist Wednesday is because we want people. First of all, I want people to know about womanism outside of the academy, but I want people to know about the work that Black women scholars are doing and all this type of things, right? But I also want the church yeah. to make the connection, right? Yeah. We want the church to understand. So, what would it look like if or how would it change church and possibly society if we start talking about this text like you talked about it in the church?
Yes.
Yeah, so one of the things is talking to women that have had these types of experience, and I write about it in the book, is that, they say things like, the church can't really help me or isn't really a safe haven for me because my pimp says I am your God, right? I supply all of your needs. And so there's this conflation of the pimp and God, or the pimp and the pastor. And so a lot of people don't trust clergy or church leaders. But I'm very intentional. I'm about to go in right now. I'm very intentional about calling out the church universal for the ways that women and girls are being sexually trafficked and abused in our churches, right? So too many leaders are aligning themselves with King Jesus when in actuality they are aligned with King Xerxes. They are trafficking and abusing women and girls, and trafficking is not just relegated to the streets, but it's happening in the sanctuaries as well. So I'm sure that preaching and teaching the story as a story of sex trafficking will have a great impact on the church and society. But What I'm endeavoring to do is galvanize people towards destroying trafficking economies in churches and society at large, because um, and in order to do that, that's going to require accountability, and it's going to require making different choices. In order to do that, that's going to require more than having background checks that aren't inclusive of sexual offenses. That's
Right.
going to require having psych evaluations, right? That's
Mm-hmm.
going to require sitting folk down or involving the police, right? That's
Mm-hmm.
going to require some bishops, some elders, some pastors, and some other leaders and to voluntarily self-disclose and to step down, right? That's going
Come
to
on.
require people to stop going to church conferences to get laid.
Come on now.
That's going to require people to stop requiring folk to come to conferences and to sleep with them so that they can get the biggest church or a speaking engagement.
Come on.
Wow.
That is going to require us stop sending preachers to different churches when allegations are made and putting other people in vulnerable positions to be abused. That is going to require us to stop blindly passing the characters of ninjas that we know are abusing people. That is going to require people to start believing Black girls and women when they disclose abuse.
Yes, yes.
That is going to require us abandoning intergenerational silence and cover ups. What does the Lord require of you?
Girl.
And all of that can stem from a responsible reading and interpretation of this one text. Because if we can label, if we can identify, and we can see what's happening to Esther as trafficking and not some idyllic beauty contest, then maybe we can see what's happening right in our midst, right in our churches, in our congregations.
Yeah. I think some people see it, but they choose silence.
There you go.
Right. It's nothing new, right? And it's not just happening to Esther. It's happening to countless girls. It's not just happening to girls and women. It's happening to males as well.
That is right.
I talk about how the eunuchs are being sexually exploited by the king as well. We are too complicit in the abuse of particularly Black girls and women, and it's time to do something different.
And you also said in this this conflict that has been created between Vashti and Esther, right? Pitting women against each other. And since you identified the ethnicities of the women in this text as brown women, right? Women from Africa, women from India, that what's being done is pitting women of color against each other. How does that play itself out in the church? Come on.
Well, in many ways, in not just being pit against each other by outsiders, but many of us choose, right, to not embrace each other. Many of us choose to not speak to my sister, to not acknowledge my sister. To many women have internalized abuse and internalized oppression and internalized sexism, and will not even give women an opportunity to speak, right? In different spaces and places. So that gets played out in contemporary society. So yeah.
Yeah. So this interpretation is revolutionary. We've and those of us who are womanists have seen this in the text, right? But I think you writing about it, I don't know if I've read anything of this magnitude in scholarship before. So it's revolutionary in that sense. And so I'm curious, have you received pushback from church women? Have you, particularly Black church women, regarding this interpretation?
Yeah, I've received some resistance from Black women. I would say it's minimal, though. I attribute it mostly to them not feeling like they can accept or engage diverse interpretations or interpretations that don't align with those traditional interpretations that they've heard, right? But for the most part, many of the Black women say to me, "Well, I knew that was what was happening in the text, but no one ever said it publicly or privately," right?
Oh,
And
wow.
so that point is connected to my curiosity of when I, first started writing this dissertation and doing research of like what abused women understood as happening in the text. And many of them said like, "Oh, that ain't no pageant. Like they being raped," right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that led me to going to the street corners and just engaging girls and women about life, sex work, and about their relationship with God. And these women knew that, what's depicted in the book of Esther was wide scale abuse
Oh, yeah.
and rape, but they were outcasts, right? They were
Mm-hmm.
shunned by the church. And so their perspectives were not solicited or valued. But like many of the women that I've met, on the streets or in the communities, many Black girls and women in churches end up disclosing to me like
Mm-hmm.
instances of sexual abuse and sexual
Yeah.
trauma, and they bear witness to this intersectional oppression and to systemic violence across contexts. And even though they don't use the same language that we use, right, they inform
Yep.
what I'm writing,
Mm-hmm.
about. They
Mm-hmm.
inform, you know, what people call theories.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
their lives, their experiences inform this work. And so instead of resisting me, what I've experienced is that Black women are collaborating with me and bearing witness to this type of trauma and resisting this type of sexualized trauma. They are I've done a few Bible studies with different churches, and like it's just amazing to hear the stories that are shared, right? And then
Mm-hmm.
they begin to resist these institutions and structures that allow trafficking to thrive. So many of them commend me for sharing their truths, well,
Yeah.
our truths,
Mm-hmm.
really. And
Can you
so
say
I've had a pretty decent experience with engaging Black women around my um, scholarship. Now, I have had resistance from other groups. Some people say this doesn't make sense, or why only focus on the African women when there are other women, or you can't apply contemporary concepts to the ancient context. And so I just kind of took on the mindset that it won't make sense to everyone, and that some people will choose for it to not make sense, right? And then some people are just dedicated to remaining ignorant. So
Mm.
I don't have to
The
share space with them.
dedication.
But if you read the book, you'll see that I'm not only writing about um, the African women, but I'm writing about other ethnic groups. I'm writing about other gender groups. I acknowledge that there's abuse of not only Ethiopian and Indian women, but the Persian girls, right, as
Mm-hmm.
well. There are different sub collectives under the collective of women. But I also write about the abuse of the eunuchs. So
Right.
I don't really internalize those critiques. I just figure that, well, if my centering of African and Africana women in my scholarship bothers people, then that's a session for them and their therapist or whoever they work their stuff out with to kind of deal with, because that's not my problem.
Mm-hmm.
it's a session for you and your therapist? But I was you were talking about the Bible studies. Now I forgot my whole question though, because I was like, "Oh, that's good." But wait, you said something like after your Bible studies, you've seen people push. I thought you said like you see some changes from the women. Is that what you were saying?
Yes, I mean, I've had resistance for some women. Reverend, I don't agree with you and those people. I say, okay, well, thank you for even entertaining and engaging my perspective, and that's it. That's the end of the conversation. But then, like, I mean, I've gone an hour after a Bible studies with women sharing and disclosing their experiences of,
Mm-hmm.
sexual abuse and trauma, right? Not only in churches, but in their homes and in their communities. And so it just becomes a sacred space to talk about intergenerational trauma, and to try to process collectively. And I've not seen that type of radical Bible study spaces. I did definitely not growing up, but and I they beg, will you come back and teach us another,
Oh yeah,
study? And so
yeah.
I had to let them know that I can't just do that, but I am willing to, have follow up conversations and just do these communal Bible studies to help people kind of process um, how their worlds are reflected in biblical, their experiences are
Absolutely.
reflected in biblical texts.
Absolutely.
Um,
Yeah. Whew. Well, you said in your intro. Did you have another question?
No, go ahead.
Okay, that you like to collaborate. That was one of the things, and I know one of your recent collaborations. You are a co-editor with Dr. Smith and Dr. Parker on "Bitter the Chastening Rod," the follow-up to "Stony the Road We Tried." Now, I know a lot of people on here know what "Stony the Road We Tried," but some people don't. Can you tell us a little bit more about this particular project? What was well, first I'm gonna ask you, like, why now, and what was the, it's been 20 years, which I think that's long enough, but there's still, things can go a lot longer than 20 years before somebody do something else. So why now? And your particular theme, I know one of the themes is like say her name and something like that. Can you talk more about the themes that y'all put together in this project, and what it was like working with other Black women scholars?
Yeah, so Dr. Mitzi Smith, as you mentioned, is the general editor for this work and the visionary for this project. And she invited me and Angela to serve as co editors. So it is the sequel to Stony the Road We Tried, which was published 30 years ago. So
Yeah,
this was
that's
published on the 30th
right.
anniversary of that work. And the titles are lyrics from the Negro National Anthem, Lift Every Voice and Sing. So both books offer contextualized biblical engagement that is sensitive to the plights of Africana people across contexts. And so these essays elucidate integrative moments where like the biblical text picks up on social issues and where social analysis and movements, especially those you just mentioned, Black Lives Matter, Say Her Name, and Me Too, like illuminates concerns in biblical text. So, I mean, we all know too well the atrocities that and intergenerational traumas that persist today among African people. The road is still stony, right? And the
Mhm.
chastening rod is still bitter. So these books assess and address the continued struggles amongst Africana people, and they offer biblical interpretation and construct theologies that opposes injustices and oppression. So the words that I can just kind of give to characterize working with other women, mutuality, respect, collaboration, and the commitment to survival and wholeness of the
Mhm.
people, which, comes from the womanist definition. And so it was not only that way between the co editors, but between the writers as well. And I just want to kind of shout out Mitzi Smith because she is a very astute,
Yeah,
generous, effective leader, professor,
yeah,
preacher, colleague, and just a wonderful mentor. And she creates opportunities for her colleagues, like
yeah.
no matter their positions or status, right? So I just wanted to shout out Dr. Mitzi for the way that she collaborates with and amplifies the voices and perspectives of folk, right? Um, and I just want to kind of hone in on like the role of collaboration. Again, I mentioned earlier how sometimes you can meet folks that won't even speak to you, like
Yeah.
they won't acknowledge you, they won't help you with your work on your journey, on your program, like in your
Mm-hmm.
programs. They just like oftentimes, and it's not just in the academy, but it's in the church as well. People
Mm-hmm.
feel
Hmm.
threatened, right? Or
Yeah.
there's just something that doesn't allow them to kind of reach out and pay it forward or, help other people. But I found people on my journey that really have collaborated with me and who have really created opportunities for me to thrive in this profession. So I just wanted to shout out some of the womanist and feminist women: Mitzi Smith, Tracy West, Nisha Jr., Rosetta Ross, Kim Russo,
Yeah.
Shively Smith, Cheryl
Yeah.
Anderson, Evelyn Parker, Musa
Mm.
Dubé, and my bishop, Teresa Thornton. these are Black women that use their power and their privilege to create opportunities for me to thrive, right?
Wow.
Not only in the academy, but in other spaces. And then I have non-Black female members of my tribe. I have Dr. Randall Bailey, I have Dr.
Yeah,
Kenneth Ngwa and Patrick Reyes and
yeah,
Nami Kim and Joanna Steebird and um, Katie Edwards. All of these people are members that of what I call my Thrive tribe, right? So
Mhm.
these are people in my tribe that really enable me to thrive. So I just wanted to kind of shout out those people who collaborate with me on my journey to do the work that I feel that God is calling me to do. And I will say that, like, this focus on collaboration is intensified in my work as I'm starting to, well, not starting to, but continuing to look at the collective action of women and their intergenerational resistance to oppression. So now I'm assessing like the books of Ruth, the book of Esther, and the women in Moses' life, and
Mm.
I'm looking at how those females work collectively to
Yes.
address systemic violence and they offer like these gender sensitive strategies to respond to threats, right?
mm,
um and it's not just the human females, but I'm also looking at how Mother Earth and how these earth elements provide sustainable resources, um and they collaborate with these human females to like not only liberate people but to keep future liberators alive. And so I think collaboration is um, a good framework, right? For us to study the Bible and study these texts, looking at the collective action of many of these freedom fighters that, to me, effectively model salvation and liberation for the males that are celebrated in history, right? So
right now.
Mhm.
women modeling salvation and liberation for Moses and Jesus.
Right.
Um, and so that these relationships that I'm in and that I'm cultivating really inspire my focus in my research on collaboration efforts.
Wow. So, as you were talking particularly about and naming the women who are a part of your Thrive tribe, it made me think about the idea and the notion of sisterhood. Um, Obviously, that's something you find important, but can you say a little bit more about the importance of sisterhood in dismantling these systems that are oppressive to us?
Yeah. So I think that's exactly how I would frame the work of all of these women that I'm analyzing as a deeply knit sisterhood, right? And when you
Mhm.
said sister, I immediately thought about Miriam, right? And
Yeah,
how she was a leader in um, keeping Moses alive, right?
Yeah.
She was one that helped to model liberation um, for Moses. And so sisterhood is very important, and that's why I am honoring the names of those persons that I called, because
Mm-hmm.
they they didn't they don't choose to hold on to grasp, to clench onto their power and privilege for
Mm.
self gain,
Yeah.
but it's to the benefit of the community. They share it to the benefit of the community.
Yeah.
And so I deeply appreciate that, because I've not experienced that in many times in the academy or in the church.
And
As a
I
matter of
think.
fact, I feel that I experienced my
Mhm.
PhD program and my ordination process as hazing, and I
Mm.
don't think either one of them should have felt
should
like
not
that. But
be
it
like
was
that.
it was
Exactly.
women that made the experience horrific for me.
And what you were describing to me, when womanism is lived out, that is what it looks like. I I mean,
The sisterhood,
the
not the hate.
sisterhood, not the hazing, not the
Yeah,
hazing,
yeah,
right?
absolutely, and that's
Yeah, when it's lived out, when it's practical, as Dr. Lynn Norris says, when it's practical, that's what it looks like.
Right.
What you
Exactly.
described, you
Yeah.
know, and that's why, again, that's why we do what we do. That's why we bring womanists like you and others to our community, because if we could hone in on that, if we could hone in on those beautiful life affirming characteristics and behaviors of that sisterhood, life
Right.
for everybody can change, can be transformed, I think.
And I
Yeah,
mean, it's enough room
absolutely.
for everybody. There's so much, there's enough room for everybody to show their brilliance. You know what I mean? Like, to allow
Right.
their brilliance. If we were all to bring our brilliance in together, and
Yes.
instead of trying to,
Yes.
what could we create? I always.
Yes.
Yeah, and that's why in my work you see me rejecting the notion, rejecting like this focus on a singular hero, right? Rejecting this pitting women up against one another. Um, because like if you reframe and read the stories to a different lens, you'll see that Esther and Vashti and all these other women, Ruth and Naomi, all of the women in Moses's life, they really were tag teaming, and they bodied the hell out of patriarchy. They bodied the hell out of
Girl,
colonialism. They bodied the hell out of curiarchy. Like, together, it was no one person that did it by herself.
Yeah.
They
Well,
collaborate.
and that's a segue into, I mean, you made me think about what Reverend Camila and I do and what we've been doing for the last 5 years, right? We are co-pastors. We have a non-hierarchical model of ministry. We each have our unique passions and giftings, and we are doing the best we can to model what you're describing to our faith community and to other people, right? That may be seeing us, that it is something that can be done, right? It is, and it can be beautiful, and it's like it saves us both, you know, because
Absolutely.
this work is too hard, and it's too much of it.
And then, I mean, not only that, as you were talking about how we have to rethink about church and what it would require, it's not like you said, there can't be we can't keep putting this one person up on a pedestal.
Yes.
And, you know, and putting all the stuff on that one person. What does it look like when you said that we tag teaming the patriarchy, the curiosity, and everything you said, like, for liberation? That's it right there. That is it.
And that tag teaming made me think, Reverend Camila and I, we do tag team preaching once a month. And so we sometimes we have the same text, sometimes we have different texts, but it's a partnership, and it's a collaboration. Yeah. And seeing God work in that is just amazing.
Yeah.
Whew. Okay, I gotta shift it though.
You gotta shift it?
Yeah.
All right.
Unless you got some more.
No, go ahead.
Because this is a conversation I want to have with her. Because this is a conversation another one of them conversations we don't have in churches. Mm-hmm. You know, I learned that you donated an organ. Am I correct?
Yes, I donated a kidney to my grandmother.
Yes. Wow. Yeah. See, this is another conversation we don't necessarily have in churches about the need of it and how they get. Can you talk a little bit about your experience in that? And what may, I mean, I know in me in my head, I'm like, it's your grandmama, so that's your yes. But that might not be your yes. So what was the reason for your yes to go ahead and do that?
Yeah, so it's two parts. One, I hate to see people suffering. And two, that's my grandmother. And selfishly, I wanted her to live longer. Right. So my grandma was experiencing kidney failure and was put on dialysis. And so while in the beginning stages, I began to research like transplantation, and I saw that if a patient has no or short-term dialysis, then they have better outcomes with transplantation. So my grandma started dialysis after this serious illness in January. I began researching like the impact of transplantation on me, on donors, right? And so by fall, I had begun the process of like being tested to see if I was a match in October. I found out, no, in October I tested. In November I found out I was a match, and in December we had the surgery. And so all of this took place in less than a year. While I was, researching and being tested, the doctors at Mayo told me, like, hey, you know that you can live healthily with one organ. So I figured, okay, if I have two, but I can live a healthy life, with one organ, why not share? And I also began to like listen to or engage people that had transplants, and they were kind of sharing that the organ donation was, probably some of the most profound gifts they received in life, because it prolonged their life and improved their quality of life. And so I began thinking, like, this is someone who took in and raised me and my siblings when our parents couldn't care for us, so why not do something to enhance her life, right? And so that was in 2013. I am still here. I have no complications from the transplant, and my grandma is still here, 80, in
Oh,
her 80s, thriving,
wow.
and she isn't having any issues, complications from the transplant. And so that experience taught me that there are diverse ways that we can give life. And
Mm,
so that's one of the ways that I decided to give
wow.
life.
Mm, mm, that was good. Diverse ways
Wow.
we can give life. Ooh. Um,
Well, we've got some questions from our community, or some comments from our community. Let me go back.
It was a question I saw.
So Donna Otis asked this question, Reverend Donna Otis. She says, "Did you have an opportunity to speak with Jewish rabbis about their interpretation of Esther?" She said they read the text as community yearly.
Yeah, so I haven't had opportunities to engage rabbis directly. I've engaged one via email, but not to the extent of talking about our different interpretations. But I will say, one year I was at the Children's Defense Fund and was just speaking to this woman that, I mean, I didn't know who she was, and was just sharing with her my dissertation. And after I finished sharing, she said, I'm a Jew. And it would be so interesting if you could come, and participate in one of our Purim services, right? And after all of the laughter, after all of the fun and laughter, if you could present your, research and your interpretation of the story, so that we can sit with the sexual trauma, because it is a serious matter, right? And so I think that there's room for the celebration and the laughter, the critique, right? But there's
Uh-huh.
also room for serious conversations about what's happening in the text, because it's not just a story about the um, potential genocide of a people, but it's also a story about sexual abuse and
Mm-hmm.
trauma, other traumas. And so there was like this desire to have a conversation about how different communities interact and interpret the text. And I think that that's a wonderful thing to consider.
Yeah, yeah. You have another question or comment you want to read?
Yeah, I'm looking. I'm looking. I'm looking. Let me see. Um, Well, there's a lot of affirmation about this, about hazing.
That hazing.
That a lot of people have experienced that. Hazing is a great word for the ordination process. One of our ministry partners, Tracy Anderson Tolado, experienced as well. And that hazing should not be a part of any of that. Thank you, DigiDeacon. Natasha Robinson has posted links to both the books, Trafficking Hadassah, as well as Bitter the Chastening Rod. So we want to thank you for that.
Those. Yeah. Did you see any other comments you wanted?
I did not.
Okay.
Mm-mm.
Make sure I got my last one.
Do you do a lot of? I know we're moving in on time. Do you do a lot of talking and speaking about trafficking, Hadassah? Do you have a lot of opportunities to present or to get this out? Because one of the challenges that it seems to me with this kind of scholarship is that it stays in the academy, right? So how is it? How can we get it out? I mean, I'm sure we wouldn't have a problem with that, right, at the gathering. But how can we get this kind of scholarship out into the church?
Yeah. So I get plenty of opportunities to engage churches, communities. It has been well received in Europe and in Africa. I've presented the scholarship at different conferences, and so it's well received. I think the challenge that we have is that, people will engage this interpretation, but then still choose to not,
Mm.
you know, preach and speak on it. I've
Yeah.
met colleagues that was like, wow, that's some really intriguing work, but I'd never preach it or teach it like that, right? And so it's going to be a challenge because people just refuse to name a thing, right? And yeah, a lot of people just don't want to deal with it, I think, because they have to sit with like their how we're culpable in so many instances, right? So I think it's just easier to ignore it or to try to
Mm-hmm.
minimize what's happening because we don't have to own
Right.
what we haven't been doing, right, to protect Black women, or we have to own what we have been doing, transgressing Black girls and women. So I don't know. I preach it and teach it every
Yeah,
time I get a chance, but
yeah,
I can't force it on other people. But
that's
it,
right.
it would be a blessing, if others would really engage this work, and engage people in their own context.
We got another question from Reverend Donna. She said, "What is your view of Mordecai, who remains in the front of the court to learn what is happening with Esther?"
Yeah, so this was one of the pieces of resistance I got in one of the Bible studies because I was invited after I did Esther 2. I was invited back to do Esther 4 or 5. I can't remember. But anyhow, I was talking about Mordecai and pointing out how Esther said no, right? When he said you have to go, before the king, and she told him, these are the consequences for me doing that. And Mordecai, threatens her. He really bullies her into
Mm-hmm.
going before the king. And one lady said, "Now, Pastor, Reverend, I can't get with you on that one. I don't agree that he bullied her." Thank you. I appreciate that you don't agree, but this is my perspective. You don't have to take it, right? But I do see that he is positioned um in places and in spaces that proves beneficial for him, because when you look at the end of the book, the last chapter,
He gets the
it
name.
doesn't even reference like Esther. It's all about Mordecai, right? There's no resistance from him, so I think he's a questionable character. I mean, but that we still have to consider that he was colonized as well, so he may
Mm-hmm.
not have been able to buck up in ways that we think or expect people to buck up against the system. But um I see him as causing harm to Esther as well throughout the book, as do many of the male characters in the book. The king, his servants, the eunuchs, Mordecai, Haman. Like, yeah, she's negatively impacted by those male characters.
Well, that question made me think about this phrase that we hear so often that Mordecai gave to Esther, you know, for such a time as this, right? Perhaps you've been called. So it's almost like a psychological manipulation, right?
Yeah,
To
gaslighting.
gaslighting. That's it. Gaslighting.
Yeah. And I talk about those two phrases in the book. Like, we
Okay.
preach and teach on them. For such a time as this, for such a time as this, as what? Like, what's happening? What is she being called to? Like, what is she being called from? What is she being called to resist? Um, and and then the one night with the king, one night with
Mm-hmm.
the king, one night with the king. Yes, you're framing it as this opportunity for upward economic advancement, mobility. But one night with the king, like, really is about being raped by the
Yeah.
king during that one night.
Yeah.
So we're inadvertently like
Man.
promoting rape culture
Yeah.
by preaching
Even
those sermons and
yeah,
singing those songs.
that song, "Take
Take
Me
me
to
to
the
the
King."
king.
Mm.
Oh, yeah.
Hmm. Yeah.
Mm, mm, mm.
Whew.
So
Well,
we have to
we
we have
go.
to be careful about, the sound biting,
Yeah,
aspects of scriptures,
yeah.
without really analyzing what's happening in the text and in the context, because we end up doing more harm than good.
Mhm.
And it makes it easy for us to overlook or not pay attention to the death dealing practices that are happening in the text. It's like we get desensitized to it. When we hear over and over again, "Take me to the king for such a time as this," as positive things, right? So even when we read the text, we don't see it
Right.
the way
Yeah.
you describe. We don't see what prostituted and trafficked women naturally see because of their own lived experiences in the text, right? Um, because it's been idealized for us
It's a fairy
Yeah.
tale for
all of
us.
our
Yeah.
lives.
Yeah, that, and people just committed to shouting people, right? To make
That
people
part.
shout, make people feel good. But how can I feel good when I've been abused, when I've been traumatized by um, males,
Yeah,
pastors,
yeah,
kings, right?
yeah,
And I
Even
mean,
some
like, in the
people,
other parts of that though is people not gonna shout when you talk about the complicity we have in trafficking. So it's like you say, it's so much easier
you
not.
can shout. It'll be a different shout though,
Yeah,
but
it
you're
is.
shouting, right? You're shouting saying, "Stop this!" Like,
No, but I mean, I'm talking about, the as
yeah,
one of my take he trying to put them on the roller coaster. Everybody jump up and throw their hands up.
Mhm.
That kind of that you're
right,
not gonna get that
right.
when you
But
what
we don't need that all the time,
exactly
right?
exactly
Right.
Like people
exactly.
living through some real issues, and they'll shout today and they're gonna come right back next week with the same moping and crying. So why
That's
not just help
And
them address the
just
issues,
help them
right?
address
And
it.
get them get the help they need. Like,
yeah.
So, can we read it? Do we have time to read? No?
No, I need to bear my last.
Okay, go ahead.
But I do want Dr. Ericka, if you get a chance, if you can go back on Facebook, because it is a couple comments on there that we just want to make sure you saw. People were talking about, because we do have one last question because we almost out of time. But you're dealing with some really heavy stuff. The work you work, I know, it's a lot to work, and deal with rape and all these type of things on a day-to-day basis, and on top of all the other work that you're doing. And I personally know it can be heavy on your spirit and everything else, but how do you care for yourself? Period.
I engage people on my own terms, and I don't allow them to guilt trip me over my boundaries. Um, I allow myself to be quiet and observant. I do things that bring me joy, such as photography, gardening. I write handwritten notes to elders. I read the stories of Black women, um, in therapy. Like, I therapy has really helped me, especially over these last couple of years, because I've been trying to discern like why I've been called to this particular work, and as I've been engaging my parents and others in my life, I've like things have been disclosed that really helped me to understand like why God called me to this work.
Right.
Um, these testimonies bear witness to intergenerational trauma in my own lineage, and I wasn't privy to this information before I started this work. And so I'm sitting with this new knowledge and I'm letting it inform my future soul work. So that's a part of taking care of myself. I'm attentive to this new knowledge and sitting with it, and I'm going to allow it to inform me as I continue to do the work that I know that I'm called to do.
Wow. Well, This was heavy. This was good. This was beautiful. This was enlightening. Thank you for joining us and participating in this Womanist Wednesday. Your gentleness, your compassion, your passion was so meaningful and seen and experienced. And I just want to thank you for that, for showing up in your authentic self.
Yes. And
thank
for your
you.
yes.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for your yes. We appreciate you. And we appreciate everybody who has been showing up week after week for our Womanist Wednesdays. This is third week. We have one more week. We did the Hebrew Bible this week, and next week we're going to the Second Testament. We're bringing in Dr. Shively to talk about it, and I hope everybody will join us for that final conversation. We are grateful, but you don't have to wait until next week to see us. We will be here Saturday at 6 o'clock. For our 1 hour worship at the gathering. We invite you all to join us. Is there anything else you want to say to the people, Dr. Ericka?
No, I just want to thank you all for the invitation, and I want to thank everyone who watched and who engaged via online. I look forward to continue engagement with you all and continued collaboration, because this work is, it's not done. We have to commit to doing it together if we want to see change. So I look forward to collaboration.